Go ahead, the CEO said with a cold smile as she flicked a crisp $50 bill through the air. Keep the change after you fail. The bill drifted across the blazing afternoon heat and landed near the worn work boots of Caleb Walker, a single father whose grease-stained hands had spent 2 decades fixing machines that other people had already given up on. Around them, the private airfield outside Scottsdale shimmered beneath the Arizona sun. A sleek silver business jet sat motionless on the tarmac, its polished fuselage reflecting a crowd of executives, mechanics, pilots, and investors who had already watched 6 certified technicians walk away defeated. The engines had refused to start for nearly 12 hours. Every delay was costing money. Every passing minute pushed an international merger closer to collapse. Victoria Sinclair, founder and CEO of Sinclair Global Aviation, folded her sunglasses onto the collar of her designer jacket and looked Caleb up and down as though he were little more than another maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong place. $5 million, she announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. That's what this delay is costing my company if this jet isn't airborne within the hour. If you honestly believe you can fix it, you have exactly 5 minutes. Soft laughter spread across the gathering. One executive shook his head. Another quietly raised his phone, expecting an embarrassing scene worth sharing later. A veteran pilot crossed his arms and whispered that even the manufacturer's specialists had failed. Caleb never looked at the people laughing. Instead, he glanced toward the shaded bench beside the hangar where his 11-year-old daughter, Lily, sat quietly with a paperback novel resting on her lap. She smiled at him with complete confidence, the kind that only a child who had watched her father solve impossible problems could give. Caleb smiled back before bending down to pick up the $50 bill. He carefully folded it once and slipped it into his shirt pocket without a single word. Victoria tilted her head, amused by his silence. Keeping it already? She asked. Caleb finally met her eyes. His voice was calm enough that several people leaned closer just to hear him. No, ma'am. I'm keeping it safe until I earn it. The answer drew another round of chuckles, but something about the way he said it made the oldest mechanic in the crowd stop laughing first. Caleb walked slowly toward the silent jet without rushing, without showing off, and without asking anyone for a diagnostic report. He rested one weathered hand against the smooth aluminum skin just below the left engine nacelle and closed his eyes for only a heartbeat. The afternoon wind carried the faint scent of heated hydraulic fluid across the ramp. Somewhere inside the aircraft, metal expanded beneath the relentless desert heat with tiny clicking sounds that almost no one else noticed. Caleb noticed every one of them. He opened a small access panel, listened instead of speaking, and allowed the silence around him to grow heavier than the laughter that had filled the air only moments before. Nobody realized that the 5-minute countdown had already begun, or that the quiet mechanic standing beside the silent jet had just heard the first clue that everyone else had missed. Caleb remained perfectly still for another moment, his fingertips resting against the cool metal as though he were greeting an old friend instead of inspecting a multi-million-dollar aircraft. The crowd expected frantic movements, expensive diagnostic equipment, or dramatic confidence, but none of that came. He slowly crouched beside the open access panel and listened. The faint clicking inside the compartment blended with the distant hum of ground support equipment, and the whisper of a warm desert breeze rolling across the runway. To nearly everyone watching, there was nothing to hear. To Caleb, every sound carried meaning. He reached into his weathered toolbox and removed nothing more sophisticated than a flashlight, a small inspection mirror, and a simple screwdriver whose handle had faded from years of honest work. One young executive leaned toward another and quietly laughed. "That is his grand plan," he whispered. "Our maintenance software costs more than his entire toolbox." A few nearby employees smiled, but the laughter faded much faster than before. The oldest mechanic on the ramp kept watching without saying a word. He had seen experienced technicians trust computers before trusting their own instincts, and he recognized something different in the quiet father standing beside the jet. Caleb swept the flashlight across a cluster of fuel lines before closing his eyes again for only a second. He did not need to guess. He was remembering. Long before life had become a steady rhythm of school lunches, grocery budgets, and repairing family cars at a neighborhood garage, there had been another chapter. Years earlier, he had spent endless mornings inside military maintenance hangars where every unusual vibration mattered, every unusual smell carried a warning, and every unnecessary part replacement wasted taxpayer dollars. The habits never disappeared. They simply became quieter. After his wife passed away unexpectedly, Caleb walked away from a career that constantly kept him traveling. Lily needed a father who came home every evening more than she needed a father with an impressive job title. So he traded enormous aircraft for pickup trucks, luxury sedans, and family minivans. He never complained. He never explained. He simply fixed what others believed could not be fixed and returned home in time to help with homework. Victoria crossed her arms as another precious minute slipped away. "You have less than 4 minutes," she called out. Caleb nodded politely without looking up. "That is plenty." His answer sounded almost effortless, and somehow that unsettled her more than arrogance would have. She had built an empire by trusting confident experts, ambitious executives, and polished presentations. This man possessed none of those things. His jeans carried old grease stains. His shirt sleeves were rolled above sunburned forearms. His toolbox looked older than some of the interns standing nearby. Yet he behaved as though the pressure surrounding the grounded aircraft simply did not exist. Lily continued reading on the bench, occasionally glancing toward her father with complete peace instead of nervous anticipation. She had seen that calm expression many times before. It always appeared a few moments before impossible problems quietly disappeared. Caleb leaned farther into the open panel, adjusted the inspection mirror, and smiled so faintly that almost nobody noticed. Hidden behind a narrow bundle of wiring, reflecting only a tiny flash of sunlight, he had finally found the detail every expensive diagnostic system had overlooked. Caleb reached carefully behind the wiring harness until his fingers touched a connector no larger than his thumb. He did not pull it immediately. Instead, he gently pressed against the housing, feeling for movement that should not have been there. A faint click answered him. Barely audible. Barely noticeable. Yet it was enough. He smiled almost imperceptibly before removing his hand and shining the flashlight across the surrounding assembly once more. The sunlight reflected from polished aluminum while waves of heat danced above the runway, making the entire aircraft appear to shimmer. Behind him, restless conversations continued to ripple through the crowd. One financial executive glanced impatiently at his watch. Another quietly complained that the board meeting in New York would have to be cancelled. A senior pilot muttered that replacement parts alone could take 3 days to arrive. Every opinion grew more expensive with every passing second. Victoria remained near the nose of the aircraft, arms folded tightly, projecting complete confidence even as frustration slowly crept across her face. She had spent years building a reputation for making impossible decisions under impossible deadlines. Failure was something she expected from other people, never from herself. Yet the grounded jet before her had become a public reminder that money could not solve every problem. Certified specialists had recommended replacing major electrical components. Another team insisted the fault originated deep inside the engine control system. One consultant had even suggested transporting the aircraft to another state for extensive inspection. Each recommendation carried another staggering invoice. Caleb quietly reached into his toolbox and selected a small cleaning cloth along with a narrow precision pick that looked more suited for repairing a pocket watch than servicing a business jet. Someone laughed again. "That little tool is going to save the day?" a young manager joked. The oldest mechanic never joined in. His weathered eyes stayed fixed on Caleb's hands. Experience had taught him that the best technicians wasted neither movement nor words. Caleb carefully lifted the connector, revealing a thin film of fine desert dust packed almost invisibly around a tiny locking tab. It was not enough to trigger a warning on most diagnostic systems. It was just enough to prevent the connection from seating completely whenever the aircraft expanded under extreme afternoon heat. During cool morning inspections, everything appeared normal. Under the blazing Arizona sun, the circuit became unreliable. Caleb cleaned the contact with patient precision before securing the connector until another soft click echoed inside the compartment. He closed the access panel without celebration, wiped his hands on a faded shop towel, and walked slowly toward the cockpit access stairs. Victoria frowned. "That is it?" she asked. Caleb nodded politely. That was the problem. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks before one of them shook his head. "Impossible," he whispered. Another mechanic quietly muttered that no repair could be that simple after 12 hours of failed diagnostics. Caleb climbed the stairs without responding to either remark. He settled into the pilot's seat only long enough to complete a careful startup sequence exactly as the aircraft manual required. Outside, Lily looked up from her book for the first time in several minutes, and closed it gently across her lap. She had seen that expression on her father's face before. Calm. Certain. Patient. As the final switch moved into position, everyone on the ramp unconsciously held their breath, waiting to discover whether the quiet mechanic had truly seen something that every expert in the room had somehow missed. Caleb rested his hand on the final switch and paused for one quiet breath. He was not waiting for luck. He was listening one last time. Through the cockpit floor he could feel the faint vibration of electrical systems settling into perfect rhythm, each relay answering the next with the confidence of a machine finally allowed to speak its own language again. Outside, the afternoon heat wrapped the aircraft in shimmering waves that blurred its silver outline against the Arizona sky. Nobody on the ramp dared to speak above a whisper. Even the executives who had mocked him moments earlier now stared through the cockpit windows with uncertain expressions. Victoria removed her sunglasses, almost without realizing it, wanting to see every detail with her own eyes instead of through dark lenses. The countdown she had announced so confidently had nearly expired. Somewhere inside her, confidence had quietly given way to curiosity. Caleb completed the final checklist exactly as he had learned years ago. No shortcuts. No dramatic gestures. His fingers moved with steady precision across each control, verifying every indication before continuing. A nearby pilot watched through the open cockpit door and slowly frowned. There was something strangely familiar about the sequence. It was not simply correct. It was exceptionally disciplined, the kind of habit developed only after thousands of hours around aircraft where mistakes were never acceptable. The older mechanic standing below the wing noticed the same thing. He took one cautious step forward, narrowing his eyes as though trying to remember a face from another lifetime. Caleb pressed the engine start switch. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Several people exchanged knowing looks, convinced the impossible dream had finally ended. Then a soft electrical whine rose from deep inside the aircraft. It grew stronger, smoother, steadier. A moment later, the turbine began to rotate with effortless confidence. The first gentle rush of air flowed through the engine intake, followed by the unmistakable sound every pilot longs to hear. The combustion stabilized perfectly. Within seconds, the powerful engine settled into a clean, healthy idle that echoed across the private airfield with calm authority. No warning lights appeared. No hesitation followed. The second engine came alive just as smoothly, its deep, confident roar blending with the first until the once silent aircraft stood ready for flight as though nothing had ever been wrong. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The entire ramp simply fell silent. The only sound left was the smooth rhythm of two perfectly running engines and the warm desert wind moving across the concrete. Victoria remained frozen where she stood, her eyes fixed on the cockpit. Her company had spent countless hours and an astonishing amount of money searching for a problem that one quiet mechanic had solved in only a few careful minutes. Lily looked up from the bench, smiled to herself, and slipped her book back into her backpack. She had never doubted the ending. Caleb completed the shutdown procedure with the same calm professionalism, climbed down the stairs carrying his old toolbox, and walked toward the gathering crowd as though he had merely finished another ordinary repair. Victoria searched his face for even the smallest trace of pride, expecting a victorious smile or a clever remark. Instead, she found only quiet dignity. Caleb reached into his shirt pocket, removed the neatly folded $50 bill, held it out toward her, and said gently, "I believe this belongs to you. I only charge people for the work that actually needs to be done." No one noticed the older mechanic quietly whisper Caleb's name beneath his breath, his expression changing from curiosity to disbelief as a forgotten memory suddenly returned. The silence lingered for several long seconds before anyone remembered how to breathe. Executives who had been checking their watches now stared at the aircraft instead. Pilots exchanged uncertain glances, replaying the flawless engine start in their minds as if they had all witnessed the same impossible moment. Victoria slowly lowered her hand without taking the folded $50 bill Caleb still offered. She looked from the bill to his face, searching for mockery, triumph, or even quiet satisfaction. There was none. His expression remained as steady as it had been before he touched the airplane. "You solved it with a connector," she finally said, almost to herself. Caleb nodded gently. "Not exactly. The connector was only the symptom. The heat changed the tolerances just enough to interrupt the circuit. The airplane was trying to tell everyone what was wrong. Nobody was listening." His answer settled over the group with unexpected weight. Several certified technicians looked back toward the open access panel, suddenly realizing how easily they had trusted expensive equipment instead of careful observation. The oldest mechanic stepped forward at last, his weathered boots scraping softly across the concrete. He studied Caleb for several seconds before speaking. "Walker," he said quietly. Caleb turned and smiled politely. "Good afternoon." The older man shook his head in disbelief. "I knew I recognized those hands. You are Caleb Walker." A few people frowned, wondering why his name suddenly mattered. The mechanic looked toward Victoria before continuing. "About 15 years ago, the military invited several civilian maintenance teams to observe a reliability program in Nevada. There was one engineer everyone talked about. Quiet. Never wasted a word. Solved problems nobody else could explain. They called him the man who could hear an engine think." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Victoria shifted her attention back to Caleb, noticing details she had ignored before. The faded toolbox was worn but meticulously organized. Every tool had its place. Every movement reflected years of discipline rather than habit. She remembered the confidence with which he had completed the startup checklist. It had not been luck. It had been mastery. "That was you?" the older mechanic asked. Caleb hesitated before answering. "That was a long time ago. You wrote part of the troubleshooting procedure for this engine series." The mechanic continued. "I still have the training manual." Several technicians blinked in disbelief. One of them quietly admitted he had studied that very manual during certification classes. Victoria looked genuinely stunned. "If that is true," she asked, "why are you repairing family cars instead of leading an engineering division?" Caleb glanced toward Lily, who had already shouldered her backpack and was walking patiently toward him with the same peaceful smile she always carried after school. His expression softened. "Because titles do not read bedtime stories," he replied. "My daughter needed her father more than the industry needed another engineer." Nobody answered immediately. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of warm asphalt across the runway while the business jet rested quietly behind them, ready for departure at last. Lily slipped her small hand into Caleb's without interrupting the conversation. He squeezed her hand gently before lifting his toolbox with the other. Victoria watched the simple gesture more carefully than she had watched the aircraft. For the first time in many years, she began to wonder whether success had caused her to overlook something far more valuable than talent. And as Caleb turned toward the parking lot with his daughter beside him, the chief pilot hurried toward Victoria holding a maintenance tablet, his face pale with astonishment after discovering a name buried deep inside the original engineering records that changed everything they believed they knew about the quiet mechanic. Victoria accepted the maintenance tablet from the chief pilot without taking her eyes off Caleb as he walked slowly across the ramp with Lily beside him. The engines behind them had already cooled into silence again, but the quiet now felt completely different. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows undeniable truth. She lowered her eyes to the screen and scrolled through the archived engineering records attached to the aircraft model. One name appeared again and again beside technical revisions, reliability studies, and field maintenance recommendations. Caleb Walker, Senior Systems Reliability Engineer, Special Advisory Team. She blinked and looked back toward the parking lot. This cannot be the same person, she whispered. The chief pilot nodded slowly. It is. I checked the employee identification number twice. Another senior technician stepped closer, unable to hide his amazement. Do you realize what those revisions accomplished? Airlines around the country still use procedures based on his recommendations. We teach some of them during certification classes without even knowing who wrote them. Victoria felt an unfamiliar weight settle across her shoulders. Only minutes earlier she had measured the quiet mechanic by his worn boots, faded toolbox, and modest clothing. Now every assumption she had made felt painfully shallow. She hurried across the concrete before Caleb reached his aging pickup truck. Lily was already placing her backpack inside the passenger seat while Caleb carefully secured his toolbox behind it. Please wait, Victoria called. Caleb turned politely. Is something else wrong with the airplane? She almost smiled despite herself. No. I think something was wrong with my judgment. For the first time that afternoon, her voice carried no trace of authority, only sincerity. She extended the folded $50 bill back toward him. You earned this. Caleb looked at the bill for a moment before gently closing her hand around it. No, ma'am. You offered it before the work was done. That was not payment. That was frustration. His words were spoken without accusation, making them even harder to ignore. Victoria slowly lowered her hand. Then let me pay your invoice. Caleb reached into his toolbox, removed a small handwritten receipt, and handed it to her. The total was $185, covering labor, cleaning supplies, and a replacement electrical connector that cost less than a cup of coffee at the airport cafe. Victoria stared at the number in disbelief. That is all? Caleb nodded. That is what the repair was worth. You saved me millions. I repaired an airplane. Caleb answered gently. The value of your schedule belongs to your business, not my invoice. The surrounding executives fell silent again. They had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet none of them had ever heard someone separate integrity from opportunity with such effortless clarity. Lily climbed into the truck and quietly fastened her seat belt, patiently waiting as she always did when adults needed a little longer to understand her father. Victoria looked from the modest receipt to the old pickup truck, then back to Caleb. Why did you never come back? She asked softly. Someone with your reputation could have led any engineering company in America. Caleb rested one hand on the open truck door and glanced at his daughter with a smile that carried both gratitude and memory. Success gave me a remarkable career, he said. Losing my wife taught me what mattered more. Every evening that I spent at home was something money could never buy back. Victoria stood motionless as the pickup eased toward the airport exit, the receipt still resting in her hand. Behind her, the chief pilot quietly opened another page of the archived records and discovered a commendation that explained why some of the most respected engineers in aviation still spoke Caleb Walker's name with uncommon respect. The airport faded behind Caleb's pickup as the late afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across the Arizona desert. Lily rested her head against the passenger window, watching giant passenger jets climb into the blue sky one after another. Daddy, she asked softly, were those people surprised because you fixed the airplane? Caleb smiled without taking his eyes off the road. No, sweetheart. They were surprised because they expected someone important to look different. Lily considered his answer for a moment before nodding thoughtfully. You still look important to me. Caleb chuckled quietly. That is because you have always looked with your heart. Those simple words stayed with Victoria long after the pickup disappeared beyond the airport gates. She returned to her office that evening carrying only the handwritten receipt and the maintenance tablet. Her executive assistant placed several urgent merger documents on the desk, but Victoria pushed them aside. Instead, she opened Caleb Walker's professional history. The deeper she searched, the quieter her office became. Technical papers, industry awards, letters of recognition from aviation safety organizations, training manuals still used by maintenance schools across the country. His work had quietly influenced thousands of aircraft without placing his name in headlines. Then the record simply stopped. No scandals. No dismissals. No public disagreements. He had resigned voluntarily less than 3 months after his wife passed away. Victoria leaned back slowly. For years she had believed that ambitious people always chased larger salaries, greater influence, and higher titles. Caleb had walked away from all three without looking back. The following morning she drove alone instead of using her company driver. The navigation system guided her away from polished office towers and luxury neighborhoods toward a modest automotive repair shop on the edge of town. There were no marble floors or glass conference rooms there. The waiting area held old magazines, a coffee pot that had clearly served generations of customers, and children's drawings taped proudly across one wall. Victoria noticed one picture immediately. It showed a smiling little girl standing beside a pickup truck while a man in blue work clothes held a wrench beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "My dad can fix anything." She stood silently for several seconds before hearing laughter from the service bay. Caleb was helping an elderly couple understand a repair estimate, patiently explaining which repairs were necessary and which could safely wait another few months. He never pressured them. He even suggested a less expensive option that would save them several $100s. The couple thanked him with genuine relief before driving away smiling. Victoria suddenly realized she had witnessed two very different versions of wealth within 24 hours. One measured success by contracts, stock prices, and private aircraft. The other measured success by honesty, trust, and the quiet confidence that people returned because they knew they would always be treated fairly. Caleb finally noticed her standing near the entrance. His expression showed polite surprise rather than excitement. "Good morning," he said warmly as he wiped his hands on a clean shop towel. "Is the airplane giving you trouble again?" Victoria smiled for what felt like the first sincere time in years. "No," she answered gently. "This time, I came because I think I have been trying to fix the wrong thing." Caleb studied her quietly, sensing that this conversation had nothing to do with engines anymore, just as a black sedan slowly pulled into the parking lot carrying 3 distinguished visitors whose arrival would soon reveal how far Caleb's quiet reputation truly reached. The black sedan came to a smooth stop beside the service bay, and 3 men stepped out wearing simple business suits instead of expensive uniforms or company logos. They looked around the modest repair shop with quiet appreciation before the oldest among them smiled the moment he saw Caleb. "I hoped we would find you exactly where they said we would," he said. Caleb recognized him immediately and extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Richard. It has been a long time." Victoria watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Richard Harrison had served for years as chairman of one of the nation's most respected aviation engineering foundations. His opinion shaped industry standards that affected airlines across the country. Yet he greeted the neighborhood mechanic with unmistakable respect. "You disappeared," Richard said. "Half the industry spent years wondering where you went." Caleb smiled gently. "I did not disappear. I simply changed priorities." Richard glanced toward Lily, who was finishing a homework assignment at a small desk in the corner of the office. He nodded with quiet understanding. "I suppose you did." Victoria remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. She realized she was hearing about a version of Caleb that had never appeared in corporate biographies or award ceremonies. Richard reached into a leather portfolio and removed several photographs. They showed maintenance crews working on commercial aircraft, training classrooms filled with young mechanics, and technicians studying manuals. "Do you know how many people still use your procedures every single day?" Richard asked. Caleb looked briefly at the photographs before shaking his head. "I never counted." Nearly every major airline in North America, Richard replied. Your work has quietly prevented delays, reduced unnecessary repairs, and improved safety for millions of travelers. Caleb lowered his eyes with the same humility he had shown at the airport. Then I am grateful the work still helps people. Victoria felt something shift inside her again. In every board meeting she had ever attended, achievements were announced with applause, presentations, and carefully prepared speeches. Caleb spoke about accomplishments that had influenced an entire industry as though they belonged to everyone except himself. Richard finally turned toward Victoria. You are fortunate, he said with a warm smile. Very few executives ever have the opportunity to meet someone like Caleb before reading about them in history. Victoria answered honestly. I almost missed the opportunity because I judged him before I knew him. Caleb quietly changed the subject. What brings you here today? Richard opened another folder and placed a formal document on the counter. Our foundation is presenting its Lifetime Contribution to Aviation Excellence Award next month. Every previous recipient has accepted. We would like you to become the next. Caleb read the invitation carefully before handing it back with a grateful smile. Thank you. I truly appreciate the honor. But I cannot attend. Richard looked surprised. May I ask why? Caleb glanced toward Lily, who looked up from her homework with a hopeful smile. That evening is father and daughter science night at her school. She has been counting the days for weeks. Silence settled over the shop once again. Victoria slowly looked from the elegant invitation to the little girl proudly coloring a model airplane beside her notebook. Without hesitation, Caleb had chosen a school event over one of the highest honors in American aviation. Richard laughed softly, not from disappointment but from admiration. Somehow, he said, that answer sounds exactly like the man we came looking for. Victoria realized that no amount of wealth could purchase the kind of character standing quietly before her, and in that moment she made a decision that would change both of their futures in a way Caleb could not yet imagine. The following Friday evening, the elementary school gymnasium glowed beneath warm lights as dozens of children proudly displayed homemade science projects across long folding tables. Parents wandered slowly from exhibit to exhibit asking questions, laughing together, and celebrating every small discovery as though each cardboard model had changed the world. Caleb stood beside Lily's display, helping her straighten a paper sign that read, How Jet Engines Breathe. She looked up at him with bright eyes. Do you think people will like it? Caleb smiled and gently adjusted the corner of the poster. They already should. You worked hard, and that matters more than winning. Moments later, the school principal stepped onto the small stage to welcome everyone, but before he could begin, several unfamiliar vehicles quietly pulled into the parking lot outside. Teachers glanced toward the entrance with puzzled expressions as Victoria walked into the gym accompanied by Richard Harrison and several respected leaders from the aviation community. None of them carried cameras or reporters. There were no television crews or publicity banners. Victoria had insisted this was not a publicity event. It was something much more personal. She approached Caleb with quiet respect instead of executive confidence. I hope we are not interrupting, she said softly. Caleb smiled. Not at all. Lily is about to explain her project. Lily confidently described how air, fuel, compression, and careful maintenance work together to keep aircraft flying safely. When she finished, Richard applauded first, soon followed by every parent standing nearby. Your father taught you well, he said warmly. Lily shook her head with an innocent smile. My dad teaches me that fixing things starts by listening. Richard laughed gently. That may be the finest engineering lesson I have ever heard. Victoria stepped forward carrying a simple leather folder instead of an oversized ceremonial plaque. Caleb, she began. Last week I believed success belonged to the loudest person in the room. Then I met someone who never needed to raise his voice to earn respect. The gym grew completely quiet. You repaired an airplane in minutes, but that was never the greatest thing you accomplished. You reminded every person who witnessed that day that dignity cannot be measured by clothing, job titles, or bank accounts. She opened the folder and handed it to him. Inside was not a contract demanding endless travel or impossible hours. It was an invitation to become senior advisor for technical excellence at Sinclair Global Aviation, a position designed around the life he had already chosen. The role allowed him to remain in Arizona, continue serving his local community, and work flexible hours that always placed his daughter first. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. I do not want to hire the engineer the industry lost years ago. I want to learn from the father who showed me what leadership really looks like. Caleb read the proposal quietly before looking at Lily. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "We can still have dinner together every night." He smiled. "That would always come first." Victoria nodded immediately. "Then the agreement will say exactly that." Caleb extended his hand, not because of the salary, the title, or the recognition, but because for the first time he believed the offer respected the life he had built instead of asking him to abandon it. As the children returned to their science projects and families filled the gym with laughter once again, the applause that followed was not for a brilliant mechanic, a successful chief executive, or a remarkable aviation career. It was for the quiet truth that character outlasts achievement, kindness outshines pride, and the strongest people are often the ones who never feel the need to prove their strength at all.